Lord Monckton.
My fellow subjects of Her Majesty the Queen, whom God preserve, it is an enormous honour to address this conference of traditional Britain. And my text for today is written in the book of Ecclesiastes at the 10th chapter and the 2nd verse. The wise man's heart is at his right hand, the foolish man's heart is at his left hand. And I combine that with Proverbs chapter 11, verse 1, which says that a false balance is abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. And then I shall cite also Pontius Pilate, who raised the only question worth asking, the question that underlies all genuine questions, the question, what is the truth? Because if we are going to examine the disease of the intellect, that is the woke form of totalitarianism, one must understand what that disease is preying upon. What is the healthy organism that the totalitarians, with their wokery, wish to attack? Well, that healthy organism that they wish to attack is the concept that there is such a thing as objective truth. There is an ancient principle that you will find, if you read widely, in Lao Tzu, in Kung Fuji, you'll find it in Aryabhata and in Bhaskara, you'll find it in ancient Egypt, you'll find it in ancient Rome, you'll find it in ancient Greece, you'll find it in Tabit ibn Qurra and Abu Ali ibn al-Hasan ibn al-Husayn ibn al-Husayn ibn al-Haytham, who was as proud in 11th century Cairo of his ancestry as I am of mine. And all of these deferred, as all true men of learning and of liberty and of light defer to this day, to the principle which goes under various names, but I shall call it the principle of the universality of truth. And that principle may be stated approximately as follows. Each proposition that is true stands consistent with every proposition that ever was or is or ever will be true throughout the universe of time and space, from the beginning of the beginning to the end of the end, and from here to the outermost stars. But every proposition that is false, whether or not it stand consistent with any other propositions that are false, falls inconsistent with every proposition that ever was or is or ever will be true. Once it is accepted, as the great religions of the Jews and of Christianity have long accepted, that there is such a thing as universal truth, and that that universal truth is astonishingly self-consistent. Any truth is consistent with any truth of any kind, anywhere and anywhen. Then you look at totalitarianism in its various forms. In this country, totalitarianism is, alas, a regrettable part of our tradition. For Henry VIII introduced modern totalitarianism into this country by insisting that people should take an oath of allegiance to the alien notion of Protestantism, and he was not willing to allow them, as Queen Elizabeth I sensibly did allow them, to keep their consciences to themselves And she said to one of her courtiers when he tried to persuade her that she too should have a totalitarian witch hunt against those who might not support her. She said, "No, I will not make a window into men's souls." But now, today, as you have heard from your speakers this morning, there is an ambition, once again, among the totalitarian classes to make a window into men's souls, to glare through that window, to find in it whatever fault they can, and then subject the proprietor of that soul to whatever condign punishments seem expedient to the governing power. But seen against the context of the fact that the concept of objective truth, truth that is true whether you or I or anyone likes it or doesn't like it to be true, the fact that that concept exists contains within it the seeds of the ultimate and, as I shall explain today, imminent collapse, not only now, but also forever, of all forms of totalitarianism. We are in the last days, not in the last days of humanity or the last days of the planet. The planet will be here in another 4.5 billion years, whether we are or not. We don't have to save the planet. It was triumphantly saved 2,000 years ago, and it doesn't need to be saved again. But my message to you today in this sermon is a message not of fire and brimstone, but of hope. For in the sheer absurdity into which the left and wokery and fascism and communism and every form of totalitarianism and extreme Islamism have descended, in that sheer absurdity lies the realization on the part of those who take the side of totalitarianism that that way of things is at last passing, and that the world will be a far sunnier place once it has passed. We are near the end of the period of misery which totalitarianism has brought to all of its victims throughout history. In recent history, we have already seen off Nazism. My father was fought and wounded. Many of our fathers were. Some died in the defense of liberty against that particular species of totalitarianism. Then we saw off Soviet communism by a powerful and delightfully unexpected combination of a Polish Pope, a wonderful American president in Ronald Reagan, and of course our very own Margaret Thatcher. Those three saw off Soviet communism, at least for a time. But now we face three particular brands of totalitarianism. Before I go into each one, I should mention what it is that totalitarianism is. It is a system of hate-driven belief in a party line where that belief has no regard, and that party line has no regard for whether what that party line is advocating is, objectively speaking, true. If you are a totalitarian, it's not only that you do not care what is or is not true. You will, wherever necessary, suppress what is true for the sake of advancing the party line that your masters in the political structure insist upon at that moment. And of course, the very nature of a party line dictated by the powers that be at a given moment, is that it can change from time to time. You'll remember the astonishment of Winston in George Orwell's 1984, when he was watching Big Brother giving a speech, and the party line changed while he was speaking. And a piece of paper was handed to him telling him the new party line, and virtually without even changing the sentence he was on, he began preaching with equal vigor, saying exactly the opposite of what he had said before. And in that observation by Orwell lay the key to my recent realization that this entire edifice of totalitarianism, and it's driven chiefly by communist China, the KGB coup in 2000 that took back Russia from the Yeltsin faction. So we've still got Russian communism, but it's now in a kind of more authoritarian and less ideological form. And then we have, as you heard this morning, extremist Islamism. And I'm sad about that third one. I'm sad that Islam has reverted to how it was from the 6th until the 9th century, when it was essentially just another militant totalitarian organization, spreading its beliefs not by explanation, not by example, but by brute force of military power. We are now back to that again. But I, as a classicist, remember well that in the 9th to the 11th centuries, it was in the Islamic world that scholarship alone subsisted. We were still in the Dark Ages. The Renaissance had not yet happened. It could not have happened had it not been for those great scholars of the golden age of Islamic scholarship in Damascus, in Cairo, and in Baghdad. So when we talk of Islam, we must always distinguish between actually the vast majority of good Islamic citizens who do not believe in the totalitarian, violent line that is handed down in far too many mosques, and those who are preaching hatred in those mosques. And let it not be forgotten that where there are hate speech laws, which can, if exploited wrongly, be used to constrain free speech, those hate speech laws will bite first and foremost against any totalitarian preacher who starts preaching hate against the rest of us. That is not to condone the notion of a hate speech law, just to say that if they're going to do that, my great belief is we should turn their engines of wickedness against them so that they see that they are engines of wickedness, and then they will help us to bring those engines of wickedness down. Don't get mad. Don't blub. Just get even. So what I'm going to propose to you today is that what has happened to totalitarianism is that it has become, in every relevant aspect, manifestly, visibly, in your face, absurd. And that word was given to me by Professor Richard Lindzen, who is the world's most formidable climate scientist, and he, of course, therefore, does not believe a word of the climate claptrap that the communists are peddling. But he said, if you look at what they say about the climate, it is absurd. So let us look at this notion of absurdity. And here I have to go into demonology. Now, demonology is the theology of evil. There is a long, substantial, and illuminating literature on demonology, and the best introduction to the subject is a 3-part work of fiction by the Anglican theologian C.S. Lewis. The first book is called Out of the Silent Planet. The next one is called Voyage to Venus, and the third one is called That Hideous Strength. The third is the best of the 3. They're all very good. And it is a meditation upon the connections between totalitarianism and evil, in that totalitarianism, because it insists upon a party line regardless of the truth, is not concerned with truth. And in traditional theology, the difference between that which is true and that which is deliberately false, such as the party lines peddled by those who peddle party lines, the totalitarians. That difference between truth and that which is militantly untrue, the difference between the liberty that comes from just looking for the truth and then speaking it when one finds it, and simply reciting a party line. That difference between truth and deliberate untruth is precisely coterminous with the difference between good and evil. Totalitarianism, therefore, is evil. But here again, demonology helps us, because evil will tend to overstep itself. It will trip over itself and become visibly absurd. And one of the reasons why we were given a guarantee by the Lord of life that the gates of hell would not prevail against the church is that in the battle between good and evil, evil at the very moment when it seems to have us most fiercely in its grip, every time just begins to look silly. And that is the moment, the glorious moment, that we have reached today. The other day, one of the endless race relations industry people lost his job here in this country because he happened to describe black people as colored people. If he had said, "Oh, they're people of color," that's a correct term. But to call them colored people, which as anybody who knows any grammar will understand, is exactly the same thing. That was so unforgivable to this new absurd form of totalitarianism that he lost his job. But in losing his job, he helped to reveal the sheer absurdity of totalitarianism. Because what this quibbling over language is all about is that it is silly, it is laughable, it is absurd, and any fool can see that. And because the left have got themselves mired in this now, they're now attacking each other because they've used the wrong stress on the syllable, or they've used the wrong phrase, or they've used the wrong series of letters to describe the 2S LGBTQIAA+ community. And they don't realize that in having all these individual letters for the real or imagined, and I suspect in reality mostly imaginary, forms of what I'm going to bluntly call sexual deviation, in using these different terms, they are beginning to treat the people who have these deviations as their way of doing things. They're treating them as individuals. But what are collectivists doing, treating people as individuals? You see how silly it is. They are beginning to realize the virtues of liberty, one of which is that each individual is not necessarily an island. There is such a thing as society, but he is an individual. He speaks for himself, he thinks for himself, and you let him have the freedom to say what he thinks. That's what being an individual in a free society is. And the moment you multiply the letters of the alphabet, let's help them out. Let's add to the 2S LGBTQQIA+. Let's add QWERTYUIOP. You just run your fingers along the top of the keyboard and that's what will come out. That gives you even more individuals. And you see how laughable all of this is. Now, in pointing out that this is laughable, are we saying that homosexuals are wicked, in whatever form of homosexuality they may be interested? No. What we are saying is, we love you all dearly. That's a phrase my housemaster used to say to us. He said, if you say that to or about any group, they will understand that you do not mean them ill. So when I say we love you all dearly to that group who do not regard sex as we would regard it, then we do not say that any of them has committed a sin, even though homosexuality is so wrong that it is regarded as one of the 4 sins crying out to heaven for vengeance in traditional theology, in the Old Testament and, of course, in the New. And in the New Testament, which is often better at explaining things than the old, it says why. Because homosexuality, particularly male promiscuous homosexuality, is gravely dangerous to its practitioners. That's why it's a bad thing. Does this mean that we do not love people who go down that road? No. But if we love them, should we not require that, just as the state says on the back of your smoking packet, this cigarette may kill you, shouldn't we say to homosexuals, you need, before you go down that road, to be given a fair and proper medical warning of the dangers inherent in that particular lifestyle choice, insofar as it is a lifestyle choice. So you see, we can deal with these wokeries by not being absurd in return, but just by saying to them, why is homosexuality a bad thing? Because it's medically dangerous. And just how dangerous was illustrated very well during the HIV pandemic, where it was found that patient 0 was a homosexual British Airways steward. Many of them seem to be for some reason. He had gone to San Francisco, which is notorious, or was at that time, for the homosexual bathhouses, as they were called, in which some of the most promiscuous sexual activity in which the human race has ever indulged used to take place. It was there in those bathhouses that the disease, which eventually became classified as the human immunodeficiency virus, first became identified for what it was. Had homosexuality not existed, and had that steward gone home to his wife, she probably wouldn't have got it from him, because there are certain barriers to transmission of that sort of disease in ordinary intercourse, which, for mechanical reasons into which I'm disinclined to go, do not apply to homosexuality. Therefore, there is a danger in homosexuality that such diseases are much more easily transmitted. And there is, therefore, an arguable case, and I put it no higher than that it was promiscuous homosexuality that led to the HIV pandemic that killed 50 million people worldwide. And that is why the absurdities that are the more exaggerated homosexual campaigning behaviors are not really appropriate. So when we address that group, we say we love you all dearly, but we are not required in loving you all dearly to love that which you do to or with each other, because, apart from anything else, of the medical dangers inherent therein. And that's the reason why the church says homosexuality is a bad idea. It's not some abstract theological reason. It is that it kills you, and it might kill a lot of other people as well. And even with modern medicine, that remains, unfortunately, too true for comfort. And therefore, if you're inclined that way, be careful now that you have been given some indication of just how dangerous it is. Now, that is the way to deal with wokery. You just take each individual absurdity and you explain the thinking behind the traditional attitude that a traditional Britain member would take. Because there are reasons why we think what we think. We do not do so on grounds of childish totalitarian prejudice, as the left do. We do so because we have thought about these things, and we understand that where the left is going is dangerous and could be mortally so. We've discussed briefly the linguistic fiddling about that's going on. And look at, for instance, the various questions that were recently addressed, both to Boris Johnson and to Keir Starmer, the leaders of our two biggest political parties. Neither of them was able to say the obvious. They were asked, does a woman have a cervix? Now, why such a question should be asked in any sensible society is another question. But that was the question which some, no doubt well-meaning communist journalists decided to address to both the party leaders. neither of them answered it. They both flannelled and faffed and wriggled because they were frightened of being destroyed reputationally if they gave the straightforward answer, which I shall now give. Now pay attention, class, because you are going to have, in full, Monckton's Gender Studies University course. Here goes. Have you got your notebooks at the ready? Here goes then. Male and female created he them. Job done, collect your degree certificates on the way out. That's how easy it is to face down this nonsense. Of course we are created male and female, because otherwise, in a very real sense, we could not be here. So let us, when faced with these absurdities, simply state the boring, obvious truth, that since there is such a thing as male and there is such a thing as female, it appears to be throughout the animal kingdom, and we are part of that. Therefore, yes, women have cervixes and men actually don't. That's just how it is. And again, if you happen to think that men can have cervixes and babies and women can have penises, then all right, we love you all dearly. But we think you're bonkers. And so if you do, as you have just done, you are laughing simply because I have described the idiocies that they are solemnly trotting out. And that is because you are beginning to see, as I am beginning to see, that these idiocies that multiply virtually every day, there's some new absurdity that appears in the papers because everybody is so shocked by it. These very idiocies are what a good theologian would recognize at once as the signs that good is about to triumph over evil, because evil, knowing that it cannot sustain the absence or contradiction of truth indefinitely, resorts to increasing absurdities as a way of escaping the ultimate reality. And that is what is happening to us now. Totalitarianism is only behaving in this absurdly woke way because totalitarianism has run out of puff. It's killed 250 million people during my lifetime. And although that fact is concealed from the students in the various Marxist schools, when they seem almost all to be Marxist now, certainly my own university, Cambridge, has been more or less completely taken over by communist China, which has bought and paid for Jesus College in particular, but also the Vice-Chancellor, who has been forced, I'm glad to say, to resign for refusing to allow free speech in Cambridge, and for trying, by a very deceptive and dishonest method, to get the academic body to come to an agreement that would have silenced free speech effectively in Cambridge forever. He did that, and I am glad to say that my colleagues at Cambridge University voted him down, and he is gone. Because in the end, they will always, the devil always does this, they will go too far. And when they go too far, just like a gnat in the wrong place, you swat them, and that's them gone. We love them all dearly as we swat them, of course. Their days are numbered, my fellow subjects of Her Majesty. They cannot sustain the nonsense any longer. They are going to have one last go at it. They're all going, of all improbable places, to Glasgow in 10 days' time, and to get the Queen and the Pope and the Secretary General of the United Nations and the President of the World Bank and Uncle Tom Cobley and all on one podium. That tells you that this is the moment at which they think that totalitarianism will at last triumph, over the libertarianism which is the great gift of this country to the world. They will find, when they get there, that they are wrong. Oh, they will come to some agreement, and it will be stated to be a historic agreement, just like the other previous 26 such agreements. But what has actually happened is, again, absurd. Over the last 25 years, as the rhetoric of communism has ramped up and the Chinese Communist Party is paying for rallies of climate change campaigners in the United States, they got caught out doing that just last week. The Russians have been funding the anti-fracking groups here. The Chinese have been influencing Boris Johnson very directly. He is, in fact, a secret Sinophiliac. He will do anything for the Chinese Communist Party, though he cannot admit it because the Conservatives wouldn't like it. But the fact is, their days are numbered too, because of the sheer absurdity of what they propose. Throughout the last 30 years, the rate at which carbon dioxide, a harmless trace gas necessary to all life, has been accumulating in the atmosphere, has continued unabated in more or less exactly a straight line. Nothing that has been said by the left has made any discernible difference whatsoever. That's how silly this is. But let me just tell you a little bit more before I finish about the silliness of this climate thing. There are three main mistakes they've made. The first is they use computer models to try to model how the climate will behave in 100 years' time based on data whose values today they are uncertain of. And anyone who knows any statistics knows that if you propagate uncertainties in data across 100 years of time steps in a model, then at the other end, any prediction of that model will be, in the formal sense, nothing better than guesswork. And a paper pointing this out by a very clever scientist at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Laboratory was published only 2 years ago. It has gone unrefuted in the learned literature ever since. And he points this out, that everything the models tell you is just guesswork. It is no better than guesswork. You might as well throw some tea leaves into a cup and get Nan to tell you what the weather's going to be. She'll probably get it right more than the computer models will. That's error number one. Error number two, they made an elementary mistake of control theory, a branch of engineering physics, when climatologists borrowed it from control theory about 1984. Interesting year. It was a communist who did it as well at NASA. And that mistake was made, and it has been perpetuated ever since. I myself, in my first published paper, made the same mistake. I have since corrected it. But climatology hasn't. Having gone down this road and told everybody we're more certain about this than anything we've ever been certain about, and the whole thing's based on an elementary scientific error, they can't admit they were wrong. But their problem is that even if they were right, there's absolutely no point in doing anything about it. That's error number three. And error number three is this, that in the last 30 years, mankind, even if you blame all of the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere on us, has added 1 unit of what's called radiative forcing to the atmosphere. 0.033 units a year, as I say, more or less in a straight line. If we were all to go from that to net zero emissions by 2050, that's what Slobberchops Johnson wants us to do, then that would mean we would reduce by half of 1 unit of forcing the amount that would otherwise have gone on upwards. And you can then work out, using their figures, how much eventual global warming that would otherwise have occurred if we hadn't acted to go to net zero would have occurred. And it is, if the whole world actually went net zero, and it's not going to, because China and India between them account for half of all emissions, and they're not going to make any reductions, and they've said so. Russia isn't going to make any reductions, Indonesia isn't, the third world doesn't have to. It's only the 20% of all emissions that now happen in the West that could be reduced. And of course, this whole climate nonsense is not targeted at the rest of the world, it's targeted at the economies of the West. This is the totalitarians finally trying to bring down the system of liberty that they so much hate and they so much fear. Well, we love them all dearly, but they're going to fail. And they're going to fail precisely because if the whole world went net zero, they would reduce what would otherwise be the temperature in 1850 by less than 3/8 of a Celsius degree. The cost would, of course, be in the quadrillions. That's all you'd buy. And in economics, there is the candy cane question, which says, gee, mister, I've been given 10 cents by my ma, I slap it on the counter in the sweetie shop, how much candy canes can I get for this, mister? If you're going to spend quadrillions of taxpayers' money, the one question you want to know is how many candy canes do I get for this, mister? How much global warming that would otherwise have been predicted to occur would not occur if we all went net zero? Well, the answer, 3/8 of a Celsius degree. But look how much worse that gets if you then realise that it's only the West that might go net zero. And even if we did, which we won't, you heard it here first, then global temperature would fall only by 1/13 of a Celsius degree. But what about Britain showing what is now called leadership by destroying its economy faster and more certainly than anybody else? There is Boris Johnson saying, I'm going to show leadership. And what does he mean? He means he's going to lead the lemmings over the cliff. Well, that is not leadership. It is, again, absurd. It is idiocy. And if he led the lemmings over the cliff and the rest of them at the last moment decided not to jump, and we were the only country in the world to go to net zero by 2050, how much global warming would that forestall? Well, the answer is 1/220th of a Celsius degree. And only that much if you believe in the figures that the IPCC and all these other totalitarian bodies peddle. The truth is that it would only be 1/550th of a degree once you correct for the error made by climatology in not understanding the control theory of feedback that it had borrowed. So that gives you some flavour of the absurdity. So where did it come from? Well, it was pushed first by Russian communism. They tried it via the miners' strike. We beat them on that. Then they tried it by capturing the environmental movement. Patrick Moore was a founder of Greenpeace. He says when the communists moved in, we had to move out because they did politics and we didn't. So we didn't know how to stop them. And he was a real environmentalist and he wasn't a communist. So he and the others left. And Greenpeace is now, it has been ever since it was taken over, a communist front organization. And it is time that such organizations, who ostensibly say they're for the environment, but they're there really for the destruction of our way of life, should be banned outright. What they are peddling is, within the existing law, high treason. And it's time they were prosecuted and locked up for a very, very, very long time, so that we can love them all dearly as we turn the key. So that, then, is a brief summary of how wokery is collapsing because it is getting sillier and sillier and sillier by the minute. And in the end, the young people who are largely infected by this nonsense, you can see some here, but they're not infected by it. But the young people who are gradually coming to realize themselves that what they're being told to parrot is obvious nonsense. And therefore, I say to you again, I conclude with this, that the world is about to be free of totalitarianism. The moment of totalitarianism's apparent greatest triumph, which will be the Glasgow conference in the next couple of weeks, it will be repellent to watch. But don't worry. That marks the end of it. From here on in, liberty, which is what this country gave to the world, will begin ever more inexorably to supplant this totalitarian, wokish nonsense. It will replace it, and once again, the freedoms on which our country will be built will be spread throughout the world, even in those countries like China, like Russia, where they think we can't do it. We can, and we will. We will give them freedom of religion. We will give them freedom to elect their leaders. We will give them freedom of trading. free markets, and above all, the guarantor of all these freedoms, we will give them freedom of speech. No longer will we be silenced by terror of the totalitarians. If they tell us to be silent, we shall laugh and we shall speak just the same. So I end then with an ancient prayer which was spoken in the stone-built churches of England for centuries. Go forth into the world in peace. Be of good courage. Hold fast that which is good. Render to no man evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the afflicted. Honor all men. Love and serve the Lord, rejoicing in the power of the Holy Spirit. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost be upon us all and upon our descendants forever. Amen.